Welcome to another Vinimark podcast, where we engage in conversations along the rough edges of wine commerce, science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers. This week, we're chatting to Robert Joseph, an international wine journalist turned industry analyst based in London. He's also recently launched a new project with Villefonte's Mike Ratcliffe that explores conversations with experts outside the wine industry to bring the best practice insights from around the world to help better equip wine producers reach the consumers. Robert, what is the name of that new business?
It's going to be called Thirst Thursdays. Now, not First Thursdays. It's actually Thirst Thursdays, just because we thought it was fun. And it's going to be the first Thursday of every month. And we just want to do something. We love chatting to each other about the way the industry is going and what we think is great about it and where we think it's falling down. But we both love hearing what people, you know about coffee, Jono. You think about some of the things the coffee industry's done. And we think, well, what can we learn from that? What can we learn from cosmetics? What can we learn from fashion? All sorts of other fields, because wine it's in a bubble. And for some reason, we end up with still talking around and around about screw caps versus corks and heavy bottles versus light bottles. And, these conversations have been going on for the last 10, 20 years. We don't seem to move forward very far. And the rest of the world's moving at a lick. We need to be ready to understand that, because our consumers aren't in the same bubble as we are. They're exposed to so much else that's going on around them. Yes, of course they love the tradition of wine. Of course they love the fact that wine is an ancient craft, and the idea of vines goes back to the time of the Bible and before. Yes, of course that's all true. But look at what's happening with beer. Look at what's happening with spirits. Look at what's happening with food. Think about how excitingly food has developed, especially in South Africa, where I've really seen it happen. Why shouldn't wine actually benefit from some of the same spirit of innovation and experimentation as we're seeing in those other fields?
Well, absolutely. And for those of you at home, I think it's that exact attitude that made Robert such a crucial voice on the panel last week during Vinimark's On Trade webinar, where we were exploring how to help restaurants find their way through in this tough time with sales restrictions and COVID restrictions. Now, Robert, if you remember on the panel, there was a huge amount of optimism, actually, about the fact that we can go out and we can do this and we can be creative and innovative. That was until last night, when the president announced that South Africa would be put back onto an adjusted level 4 COVID lockdown. And so now all restaurants and bars have been instructed to close their doors. They are only allowed to operate on a takeaway basis. And the sale of liquor, either in an on-consumption or off-consumption context, has been prohibited for now. So the question I've been asking since this happened is, so what now? How do restaurants and bars use this time to regroup and plan for beyond this ban, rather than sitting helplessly and bemoaning their fate? So that's why I thought it was so important to get you in here to share your thoughts.
Well, thank you for this. I think what's important is we did a session. I was doing something called The Real Business of Wine with a friend called Polly Hammond, which you can find on YouTube. And one of the sessions we did there was with a number of sommeliers in the US, one of my favorite sessions. And one of the things they came up with, was say the good thing. You've got to look at any situation and say, is there anything good to think about? And he said, well, what's been great is to be able to sit down and think. He said, before COVID, we were running 24/7. Just putting out fires and doing things and planning new things, but never getting around to the new thing that we're planning because we're so busy dealing with today. He said, I've actually had a really productive time thinking about what we could do, how we could do it, and it's been a great time to be creative. So that's the first thing that I'd say. So yes, it's a roller coaster. It's a roller coaster for all of us. I'm actually in isolation at the moment, so I went to Italy briefly, but as of today, in Europe, they're discussing whether Brits are going to be allowed into Europe or not. So the roller coaster of one kind or another is affecting all of us. I think in terms of the on-trade and the on-premise business, you just mentioned takeout is the only thing you're allowed to do. Well, how many restaurants out there were doing takeout before COVID? Yes, of course, there were restaurants that specialized in that, and fast food joints and so on. But I think one of the fascinating things that's come out of this situation is the number of very top-class establishments that have learned about actually supplying food to people to eat at home. And that changes everything, because the way people are going to deal with your food when you haven't got your waiter and your plates and you may or may not be supplying your plates, but generally the ambiance obviously isn't there. It actually is, by definition, a game changer. And I think it's going to be a good thing. And I think that a lot of restaurants, even as and when we get back to some kind of what we'll call the new normal, how many restaurants are going to give up that service that they've actually created and set themselves up to do? And I think one of the things that brings up is crucially the communication that it's actually created. Because before now, basically people either just walked into your restaurant, or they picked up their phone and said, "Can I have a table for two tonight?" or whatever. Suddenly now, we're in a situation where they are communicating with the restaurant online. So yes, we had restaurant websites before. How many people really looked at them? Yes, if you had a vegan or a vegetarian in your group, you might check to find out whether the restaurant had those options. And if you're a real wine geek, you looked up the wine list online. But how many people, honestly, out of 100 people sitting in a restaurant in the pre-COVID times, actually did that? I'd say it wasn't very many. Today, it's become far more of a thing. So, of course, what it does mean is that you are going to use your website far more than you ever did. And you're going to have to start thinking about it. You're going to have to start keeping it fresh. You're going to have to start thinking about, what are we going to put on the website landing page this week that's going to attract attention and going to keep people interested who saw something different last week. And then, and this gets very important, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. It's actually, instead of saying what a website is just a few pages on a screen, you should be talking to someone, even at the cheapest level, even at somebody do-it-yourself website level. You can begin to analyze who is looking at which pages. And you can say, oh, it's really interesting that the page we've got of fish is attracting less interest than the page we've got of meat. Or the fact that when we used a picture of someone when we actually had a picture of a man catching a fish, it actually got more interest than the picture of the fish on the plate, or vice versa. So that's the first thing I'd say, that actually begin to think about how you're going to communicate with people at that level. Then when we're talking about in the restaurant, now there's a lot of discussion about whether iPad lists are better or worse than printed lists, and blackboards. And they're not necessarily appropriate to everywhere, but it depends what your iPad list, other tablets are available. It depends what your tablet looks like. It depends how you present it. But if you think about a restaurant, you think about how much time in any restaurant, you've got one person sitting by themselves because somebody's gone off to the toilet or whatever, or somebody's arrived late. At that point, your iPad list could become an entertaining item. But does it have to be an iPad wine list? Is it an iPad with menu, wine list, and other things on it? And then on that point, could you be using that tool to say, hey, come back next week and we're doing a Tempranillo festival or whatever it is? Can you start to think laterally beyond what I'm doing here is saying to the customer, do you want the Pinotage or the Cabernet or the Merlot, and you want to spend this much rather than that much? So I think that it's actually wanting to communicate. Start from there. And when I say communicate, very, very importantly, is that's a two-way process. It's not you talking to them. It's you listening to them, or giving them, the customers, the opportunity to communicate with you. If you want to do that, the means of doing it today are broader than they've ever been, and they're affordable. I mean, in many cases, in social media, they may well be free.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk a little bit about that, because we chatted previously about how inept wine producers or restaurants are perhaps at knowing who their customers are. And you mentioned how a good sommelier is a little bit like a psychologist, in that the moment he sets eyes on his customer, he needs to know what makes them tick. Now, that might work for one-on-one sales, but can you give us some great examples of restaurants and wine producers who know how to listen and who can do that at scale?
I think, well, there's a lot of, I'm not going to give some very specifics, but I've seen all sorts of initiatives. And among them, one of the most, the simplest and the thing that can work is quite simply initiatives. In other words, let's say we run a rosé campaign. We're going to do a week in which we're really going to focus on rosé. Um, now, you can do this in a small restaurant. You can do this in a restaurant that seats 50 people. We just say, next week, we're going to talk to all our suppliers and say, right, can you give us some interesting rosés on sale or return? In other words, if we don't sell it at the end of the week, we'll give you some of it back. Let's talk about a price. But if it really works, we're going to list it and promote it. Give us some kind of deal on giving us wines to sample and so on. Now, what we're going to do that week is we're going to see who reacts, and we're going to see what kind of rosés they go for. We're going to try some darker rosés, and actually nobody touches them, or yes, some people do. And we're going to pay our staff. We're going to incentivize our staff to actually watch what happens at the end of each evening. We're going to say, how did this work? How did that work? It's going to be quite primitive. We're going to use, whether we use an Excel spreadsheet or we use a notebook with a pen. We're going to say, hey, this is quite interesting. The people who ate this kind of food tended to order more rosé than the others. And we sold more rosé by the glass than we did white wine by the glass, or whatever it is. But you begin to build a picture. And to my mind, I think what's crucial is to want the data. If you want the data, if data isn't a scary thing that the big organizations do and I can't do, you're not going to work. If you actually say, look, how can I find out what it is that my customers are doing in my restaurant? And then ideally, if you're really bad at it, what you could do, and this gets even more wild, is you could say, well, actually, I have friends with 3 other restaurants, maybe in other cities and other places. So you say, hey, look, you're in Pretoria, and he's in Durban, and I'm in Cape Town, he's in Joburg. Can we all, we've all met at some conference somewhere, so we all know each other. Can we all try and do the same thing? Now, we're all small restaurants. None of us has got a big budget, but we're all going to try and do the same thing for 1 week at the same time. We'll all put it onto our websites. We'll all use social media to tell people. And then we can sit down and do a Zoom call at the end of the week and say, hey, what did you find? You've got different climate, different social backgrounds, all sorts of things. Did we find the same things? Could we learn anything out of this experience? And I think that, I think the thing to do, and I always say, learn from the big guys. So Coca-Cola employs some of the cleverest people in business, and they've got unlimited funds. So what you do is you look and see what businesses like them, like McDonald's, like Burger King, the others do, and say, how can I adapt some of their learning for what I can do with my tiny budget in my tiny place? And surprisingly often, you can say, well, actually, there are some things you can do. So you can say, right, there's an idea that somebody had, which was share a bottle. So there's an expensive bottle of wine, and we will actually, so let's say we've got a bottle of, it could be Bordeaux, it could be Burgundy, it could be a great old South African wine. How are we going to deal with this? Well, we're going to actually, on next Saturday, this bottle has got 20 samples in it. We're only going to open it if 10 people, 12 people all sign up for a taste. So you do this online, and 20 people have signed up. They're all going to have a taste of that wine because it's a unique bottle they'd never get otherwise because it's going to cost so much money. And they all turn up at the wine bar or restaurant that evening. They all get their glass of wine, and they've all paid for it at an affordable rate. But hey, you've introduced a lot of people to each other. And the interesting thing to me about that story is that was a wine initiative that was born out of something people had seen Coca-Cola do. So, that's the sort of way I'm thinking. I don't think anyone's got silver bullets or magic recipes or whatever. It's actually use your initiative, but also listen to other people. Talk to your kids, talk to people who aren't in the wine world or the catering, the restaurant world, and say, what's happening in the music world, what's happening in the entertaining world, whatever. Okay, those may not be happening this week through COVID, but in principle, in the bigger scene, what initiatives are we seeing elsewhere?
Well, I love that idea of small restaurants collaborating with one another in order to improve the quality of their data set. Because often people do go, oh, if I'm going to do this, if our data is going to mean anything, if I'm going to get significant enough of a sample size, it's either going to be some expensive marketing consultant or, massive data rich studies that again cost a lot of money. So that idea of collaboration is beautiful.
But I think the other thing to say is that this podcast has got Vinimark behind it. I think if you've got a good wine supplier, talk to them. And if you're dealing with wine from particular farms, talk to them, because actually information shared is information potentially doubled or tripled or whatever. So you can say to farm X or Y, where else are you selling? Who else do you think we can work with? So you may not know that restaurant in Joburg, but that farm in Stellenbosch or in Hermanus might well say, actually, I'm going to put you two together. I'm going to put you together with whatever, and we will all share the data. So I think there's a lot to do, and I think it may well be that as restaurants and on-premise outlets, you can start some of these things going and actually work with the wine industry productively.
I love the attitude that you've been outlining so far. It seems to be at its core just a curiosity in that we are facing a whole lot of changes and challenges, but we need to cultivate an attitude that asks questions regularly, because usually if you don't ask the questions, you don't get the answers.
I think the key questions for me are why and why not. And somebody says, well, you don't make sparkling. People don't make sparkling red wine. You go, why not? People have done it. People did it in Italy back in the day. People have done it in Australia very successfully. Hey, why not make a sparkling red wine? Well, who's going to want it? Well, why don't you make a small amount and try it at your cellar door? And if nobody likes it, then fine. You haven't wasted very much. I think restaurants actually have a lot to teach the wine industry, more than vice versa, if I could say so, because in a restaurant, you actually, if you're going to survive, every day you are watching what people are eating. So Jancis Robinson, her husband Nick Lander had a restaurant in London, and the chef Martin Lambs, great cook. And I was talking to him a long time later, and I said, I remember he used to make an absolutely brilliant little spinach tart, which is something I had every day. And he's, I hated that dish. And I said, what do you mean you hated it? He said, well, I loved eating it. He said, I hated making it because I just had to go on. I wanted to take it off the menu. I always wanted to take it off the menu because I was bored doing it. I wanted to do something else. He said, but the customers loved it. So I couldn't take it off. It was something they came to the restaurant for. He said, I tried all sorts of other things I wanted to cook, and the customers didn't like them, and so I didn't do them. You do them once or twice, you adapt them, they don't come back. That to me is what being a successful restaurant, being a successful on-premise outlet is all about. It's learning from your customers. And back to what you were asking earlier on, it's what a sommelier does on a one-on-one basis is he can recognize that those two men on table 4 are out for a business lunch, and they don't want to spend time looking at a wine list. Table 7 is a man trying to impress somebody with how much money he's got, so he's going to go for the expensive bottle. And table 9 is somebody out on the first date, and he's really very nervous, and he hasn't a lot of money, but he wants to look okay. You deal with those 3 tables different.
I think what you were saying about the idea of a good on-trade establishment or restaurant being someone who really taps into the customer's needs over their own creative flair, I think sometimes that can be seen as an inferior way of doing business because food is art or wine is art. But perhaps in a context where we're finding ourselves now, where pressure is higher than it's ever been, there is a need to touch base with the customer first and let your creative flair come a second to that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they go hand in hand. I think, in a sense, how many restaurants, the thing you've not been able to do, obviously patently through the COVID time, is increase personal contact with customers. But let's say when we're coming out of this, you say, right, I'm going to run cooking courses in my restaurant. And why not? Why not say, what are you doing on a Monday afternoon anyway? Or you're closed on Sunday or whatever day it is. You say, right, I'm going to actually do cooking courses, and you're going to come and learn to cook some of the dishes that you like eating in my restaurant. And, when we've done that, you're going to eat the dish you've cooked, and you're going to drink some wine, and I'm going to get one of my wine suppliers, one of the wine farms or whatever, to come up with the appropriate wine for it. It's an easy initiative to do. You may or may not make it work. One of my local restaurants down the road from me here in the country, in England, has lots of courses, and one of them that I want to sign up for is knife skills.
Huh.
It's the sort of thing I'd never thought of going along to learn about knife skills until I saw the blackboard outside their place saying, "Come along and learn about knife skills." And then COVID came along, and so I'm still chopping off my fingers at home. But you get what I'm talking about. I think
Yeah.
that there are initiatives that restaurants can do, and of course, what's appropriate for a Michelin-starred restaurant in Franschhoek, if you like, is not necessarily going to be the same for a wine bar in Cape Town dealing with casual tourists. You have to cut your suit according to the cloth you've got. But I think that the new normal is not going on doing the same thing every day unless it's working. And again, if being a steak restaurant and doing good steaks every day, you can fill your restaurant, don't change it. If it ain't broke, for goodness sake, you don't need to change anything. But if you need to move forward, to actually build up numbers and to create new audiences as well, to bring in new lots of people, you've got to experiment.
Yeah, well, that came out strong in the webinar that for all the changes that are happening, people are still people and they crave connection and they crave novel experiences. And so, if there's a way to create those uh, around your core business, then you're onto a winning wicket, I guess.
I think the thing to say, and this was before COVID, one of these you kept hearing about was experiential experiences. And I think it is, to me, I've always been fascinated by time and money are extraordinarily relative. Essentially, you can spend 10 minutes of your life standing waiting for something, and you can spend 10 minutes watching an exciting sporting event, and the time passes at a very different speed. And the same thing applies. You can spend £100 or whatever the currency is, again, on a boring rugby match, and you think, why do I spend this money? Or you can spend it on a great meal, or you can spend it on a piece of furniture that you can hand on to your kids. It's the same amount of money, but it's going in different ways and with different results. And I think what we're talking about, certainly in terms of bottles of wine and on-premise experiences, is that word experience. What you want is somebody in 10 months or even 10 years to say, do you remember that evening when we went out to X and had Y? And the great moments, you can say, yeah, and do you remember how they cooked the fish? And do you remember what the waiter said when he served it? And do you remember who the people on the next table? And the great moments, you remember all of it. And that has been worth every penny or cent you paid. But the meal, when you said, but what did you do last Monday? Or what did we do? We went out to a restaurant. What did you eat? I can't remember. Well, that was wasted money.
And I think maybe that ties into what you were talking about, how menus and ordering platforms can become a lot more interactive as well. You mentioned, I think, some estates have produced little videos of their winery or of the winemaking process to go along with the listing, which is possible if you have a digital ordering platform. And
Yes.
so there you're creating an experience just in the way in which you choose your drink. You've got a memorable experience before you've even tasted the product itself.
I remember when wine tourism in South Africa was in its infancy, and in Europe it still is in its infancy in many places. But you go to if you like Rue Constantia, you go to La Motte, or you go to Creation, you go to any of these places, you will remember that experience. And yes, the wine, the quality of the wine is part of it. Of course it is. But actually, it's everything else. It's the atmosphere. It's the shop that you went through and the things that even if you didn't buy anything, doesn't matter. You're going to remember what you saw and the sounds and the great thing. South Africa, you've got the climate. You've got so much in terms of the colours and the smells and the flavours and the people and the music. You're very spoiled in the sense of many of those things. So you've got a palette of colors to play with.
Well, talking of customer experience, I want to shift the conversation a little bit and reference back to what we talked about in the webinar about the innovation in the way wine is packaged. The discussion was about creating wine by the glass and lowering the barrier to entry for diners to choose your wine over another wine in a restaurant. And we were talking about the need to cut packaging costs potentially in order to create more effective single serving options. But whenever we discuss these sorts of things, and obviously bag and box is mentioned, and I remember you talking about bagnums, which is the first time I'd heard that term. We have to.
A bagnum is effectively a bag and box without the box.
I just love I always love a good pun. But we have to acknowledge that as humans, our enjoyment is very much affected by what we see before we taste. And so if we order a glass of wine but see it coming out of a bagnum or a cardboard carton, it's very difficult, at least in a South African context, not to feel like we're getting an inferior product. But
you don't want that. Essentially anywhere it's going to look inferior. In the home, it's going to look inferior. But think about it. We've accepted draft beer for a very long time. So
exactly,
so the keg system, but kegs are, I think, are going to be part of the future of wine. It's not everyone's getting it right. It's not all easy and so on, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen more and more because environmentally it makes sense, and in terms of efficiency for everyone, it makes sense. In a busy bar, the idea of opening bottles one after the other is just crazy. Even with screw caps, it's just crazy. And then you've got leftover bottles. At the higher level, we've now got obviously the potential with Coravin, other methods to keep wine fresh, even without that sort of level of expense. You can get yourself an argon cylinder and a pump and a hose, and you can pump a bit of argon into bottles at the end of the evening and keep wine fresh for 2 or 3 days pretty easily. There's a lot of pretty simple ways of keeping wine fresh for shortish periods of time, which is maybe should be all you need. But the question really is, what can people see? So I painted the picture, I think, when we talked last time. The brilliant Frenchman Jean-Charles Boisset, who now lives in California and owns various Californian wineries, came up with the idea of putting his bag in box, and he's putting Bourgogne, decent Burgundy, into bag in box in a wooden barrel. And the wooden barrel it's a small barrel that sits on the counter of the restaurant, and out comes the tap at the back. And as far as anyone's concerned, it's wine coming out of a barrel. Well, what's wrong with that picture? Other things are to have carafes. You actually go down somewhere and get someone to make you a set of proprietary carafes for your restaurant, or indeed special glasses for special wines. But then you can say, well, what about tags? So, people forget. I did a book on the art of the wine label a long time ago, and we've only had wine labels for about 150, less than 200 years. What we used to have before that, if you look up the word wine label, it was a silver tag that hung around the neck of a decanter. And you could go to Christie's or Sotheby's, and they had auctions of wine labels, and these were the old silver tags, and they would say claret or hock or gin or whatever, because the wine didn't come in a labeled bottle. It came in a barrel that your butler tapped into, filled bottles, and the bottles went into decanters, and you never saw a bottle. So, but we can actually recreate some of that. We can say, right, you've got a neutral container, but maybe it's got a really nice little tag around its neck that says what it is that you get made, and maybe that tag has the name of your restaurant or whatever on it. Another idea is flights of wine, which I think is something that we need to see more of. And the Americans are huge on by the glass. A large proportion of wine in America is sold by the glass. 65%, I think, is the figure I saw, but maybe more than that. But they're also very big on wine flights. And, you can actually have, I sat at, I think it was Los Angeles Airport or San Francisco Airport, and had a flight of 6 different Cabernet Sauvignons. And each one comes in a small sample, a small serving, with a little card around the base, which says this comes from X winery, and this is the alcohol, and this is where it's from, and so on. And of course, today you could put little QR codes on there, and on my phone, I could actually see the place it did come from. In Canada, I remember a brilliant initiative. I've not seen it anywhere else, but it's a really lovely idea, which was somebody come up with a little wooden painter's palette with little slots. And they'd got little glasses that sat into the painter's palette. And again, there was space there for the names of the wines, for cards, names of the wines to be put in there. But this is absolutely an experience. You can say to me, I'm going to give you 4 different or 5 different South African Cabernets, or I can give you Cabernets from 5 different countries, or I can give you different Cabernets or different wines from the same winery. There are so many different versions of that you can do, and especially on a table, suddenly you're in the same, it's like eating Chinese or Indian or tapas. Suddenly you're sharing. Now with COVID, there's a warning here. It may be that we're going to be doing less sharing in the future than we've done in the past. So, we need to be aware of that. But the concept there is still interesting. The concept of 5 of us sitting, 6 of us sitting around a table, all of us tasting different things and talking about and sharing that information and those opinions amongst ourselves.
I mean, that's exactly it, right? In a world where people are spending more time at home or are a little more reluctant to go out, part of the challenge is to create experiences that the consumer cannot create at home. And I think 6 Cabernets from around the world is something that most consumers, at least in South Africa, would not necessarily be able to do at home. But a restaurant is far better positioned to do that. And even within COVID, I suppose there's ways to do that in fashions that are safe and where people aren't sharing.
And what I was going to say, I think that this is going to be a two-way street, though. It's going to be something that we're going to need the wineries, the wine farms to be involved in. We're going to need the distributors like Minimise to be involved in, and we're going to need the on-premise people to involve. So basically, I don't know who it's going to start from, but in each case, it's going to be a cooperative effort. And you're going to fail. I think crucially important. Some things are not going to work. Some initiatives will fail, but you will learn more from the failures than you will from the successes.
Yes.
So, you've just said people in South Africa will want to do a Cabernets around the world. You'll find that some restaurant will run it and nobody will buy it, or they won't pay the price you've asked for it, or they won't like the way you've marketed it, or whatever. And you'll say, right, so either we bin that idea or we say, well, we'll try it in a different way. But you learn from that experience. And ideally, again, if you're working with farms or you're working with a distributor, you share that experience with them. And I mean, why are consultants successful? I do consultancy. What do you learn? You learn from what you've seen other people succeed with and fail with, and that's what we need to do. You need to be watching and saying, and that, I think it's a very good lesson. There's a woman I knew in London with a set of brilliant bars that she sold for a lot of money. And she and her sister ran this set of bars, and she and her sister between them they spent 3 months a year between them traveling. All they did was going to bars all over the world, picking up ideas and saying, they've got this, they've got this, they've got this. And a lot of these things were incredibly simple. But she said one of the things she did, and this is politically, well, I don't know how correct or incorrect this is, but she said, I love employing gay male staff because it's actually built up the number of women. I never used to get women coming into my bars by themselves. They didn't feel comfortable by it, and indeed even waiting for their date. She said it was really the moment we actually brought in men who we knew were not going to hit on those women, who those women knew they were not going to get hit on, with whom they could have a really nice chat while waiting for something. It worked, and she said that was one of my secrets to making my bars work. It's really simple, but it's psychology. It's just sort of thinking, what is it that's going to make these people feel comfortable? And she was doing, she was running bars in London at which she was doing learn how to make cocktails. How many people are doing that? Why? But why not?
And I guess what it sounds like is that she was intensely interested in her customer. And that is what we've been talking about again and again, is just asking questions of your customer and who they are.
Absolutely. To be honest, I think we're living in a world that it's all about being inclusive in every single way. So it's actually trying to make somebody who's come into your establishment feel included in the experience, and indeed to make the staff feel they're included in a situation which they're giving a great experience. So that at the end of the evening is, if you know anyone who's been in the arts and in music or in theatre, at the end of the evening, how did tonight go? Did we give the audience a good time? Was the audience difficult? Did they make it hard for us to give them a good time? But that's what the next day you get up and you do it all over again. And that's what I grew up in the on-premise world. I grew up in a hotel and restaurant, so I know exactly what it's like, and I know exactly what it's like to have a really rough evening where you've had a lot of very unenthusiastic customers, or you've had only 3 tables or whatever it is. But there's the next night, the Saturday night, where it's like a party. And everyone's having such a great time, and you don't know why that evening has worked so well and the other evening hasn't. But at the end of that evening, you're on a high because they've been on a high.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for giving time again today. And it's just amazing to hear the common threads of communication, innovation, and collaboration seem to come out in almost all of the of your insights and your answers. So hopefully the business owners, whether in wine or not at home, have managed to find how to apply that in their particular context.
Well, thank you. I look forward to being back in. It's been a long time being back in the Cape, and actually coming to see what's happening, and actually come and enjoy some of the food and drink there. Because, as I said earlier, I have seen the revolution in food and drink in South Africa over the last, I'd say, 30 years, and it's one of the most exciting places for that reason.
Well, absolutely. We look forward to hosting you when you are next allowed to travel here.
I'll hold you to that. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Robert.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vinimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.